Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Newseum's Night TV studio and a very special edition of our signature program, Inside Media. My name is John Maynard. I'm Director of Programs here at the Newseum. Well, 50 years ago this Monday, James Meredith, the first black student at the University of Mississippi, was on the second day of his solitary march against fear to promote voter registration when a sniper opened fire. The AP photo of Meredith sprawled in agony on the highway after being shot ran on front pages nationwide. While Meredith recovered, civil rights organizations joined forces to finish the 220-mile march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi. The Pulitzer Prize-winning photo, which you can see on the screens, can be seen both in our Pulitzer Prize photographs gallery here at the Newseum and the Civil Rights at 50 exhibit, which also expands on the March Against Fear. We hope you get a chance to see that. Today we are so honored to be joined by James Meredith's wife, Judy Meredith, who will talk more about the events 50 years ago, as well as her husband's integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962. We'll also hear from James Meredith himself in an interview taped earlier this year by two graduate students of the Meek School of Journalism at the University of Mississippi. The names were Logan Kirkland and Jared Boyd. Joining Judy on the panel today are Sidna Brower Mitchell, who was editor-in-chief of the student newspaper, the Daily Mississippian, in 1962, and Henry Gallagher, the officer in charge of Meredith's security detail when Meredith did integrate Ole Miss. He's also the author of James Meredith and the Ole Miss Riot, A Soldier's Story. We are in good hands today with our moderator. To my left, William Doyle. William is co-author of James Meredith's memoir, A Mission from God, and also the author of the multiple award-winning An American Insurrection, James Meredith and the Battle of Oxford, Mississippi, 1962. William is a 2015-2016 Fulbright Scholar based in New York, and has written 15 nonfiction books and produced TV programs for HBO, A&E, and PBS. Speaking of books, we'll be seeing images today from the book Riot, Witness to Anger and Change. The book is a pictorial chronology of the integration of Ole Miss with pictures taken by Ed Meek. Ed was a 22-year-old staff photographer at the university at the time. He later became the vice chancellor for public relations and marketing and associate professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi. He also established the Ed Meek School of Journalism and New Media. And copies of that book will be made available following the program, as well as Henry Gallagher's A Soldier's Story and William Doyle's An American Insurrection, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign copies. I want to acknowledge Altria Group, which provided contributing support for our 1966 Civil Rights at 50 exhibit. And Inside Media programs are made possible with generous support from Kate Headline in honor of her husband, Bill Headline, who was CNN Washington bureau chief from 1983 to 1996. In addition, special thanks to Newseum trustee Will Norton and Larry Wells, who are co-publishers of the book Riot. Before we start the panel, I do want to introduce the 6-minute interview with James Meredith. Enjoy.
I want to ask you about your legacy. I've seen that you say that you are not a civil rights hero. Instead, you're a warrior. You've been a warrior, and you're on a mission from God. What exactly have you been fighting for? What exactly did you fight for?
To destroy the system of white supremacy.
Now, Mr. Meredith, you had a 14-month legal campaign to force the state of Mississippi to kind of respect your rights as an American citizen, United States citizen, and admit you into the University of Mississippi. So, was there any time during this campaign that you had any doubts that, this wasn't going to work out?
That 14 months was to give the really bad white folks in Mississippi a chance to not do what was the usual procedure, eliminate any threat to white supremacy before it can become any real concern.
So were you worried that, you know, your campaign to get into the university wasn't going to work out?
I ain't
you know?
never been worried about nothing except doing what God ordered me to do.
And you know, when God ordered you, you know, how did you know for sure that that's what you had to do?
Before I was 5 years old, maybe even before I was 4.
You know, what was told to you, or what was the sign, I guess, that gave you that inspiration?
That I would change the world as I knew it. At that time, it was Kosciuszko, Mississippi. And I didn't know what the world was going to be like that I was going to create, but I knew it was going to be different from that world.
What part of that journey do you think was the turning point to defeat white supremacy?
The first day at Ole Miss, the very first day at Ole Miss, I was ahead of the game. James Meredith and the United States government won one day.
One day.
And every day before that, we'd been losing. Every day since that, we'd been losing.
Could we talk again about the March Against Fear? Along the way, I read a lot of outlets that said that there was a white indifference as you walked along the way. But I've seen video from this time period. I've seen video of you walking down those streets, and I saw people cursing at you. I saw people yelling at you, and we know ultimately you were shot. You know, what was the response from white people? What were the things that people were saying? What were the things that people were doing?
There wasn't but one response that had any significance, and that was James Meredith's response.
Right.
The man that shot me was so irrelevant. It was more than 40 years before it was important enough for me to find out who he was. Because he didn't leave home to shoot me, he got caught up in the whatchamacallit of the day. The people responsible were the rulers of Mississippi.
Do you see yourself as an activist?
I'm a soldier. And ain't no soldier that I ever heard of describe themselves as an activist.
Right. History, some historians, they portray you as sort of like an enigma. I was going to say an enigmatic figure. They say that you're misunderstood, these sorts of things. How do you feel about that term, enigma?
Well, if I feel anything about it, I feel like a failure, because my mission from God is to get the people to do God's will. And any time people are not doing what they ought to be doing, it's my fault.
You talked about being a soldier, and you know, all soldiers in every battle, there's always history of it. And so, are you ready to kind of claim your spot in history, with this entire state of Mississippi?
I ain't dead yet.
As you continue on this journey, as this mission from God, and that is the title of the book, as Logan has here, how would you like to be remembered by, from small children on up? How would you like to be remembered, Mr. Meredith?
Well, as being eligible to get through the door. My God been pulling on my coat, said, James Meredith, I mean, you come up here knocking. You ain't gonna get in. So you better start looking down. So I'm gonna try to fix it.
Right.
Where when my time roll around and I come knocking, I'll have a better reception than he's been telling me I'm entitled to up to now.
I'll now turn it over to our moderator, William Doyle.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here. It's a great honor to be on the stage with Judy Meredith and Sidna Brower Mitchell and Henry Gallagher. Before I ask them some questions and invite you to ask them some questions, I wanted to remind the audience of who James Meredith is. In my opinion, he is a bolt of lightning that lit up the sky of American history 3 times. The first time was in 1962 with the so-called, with the riot, which was actually a state-sponsored insurrection that happened in Mississippi for 14 days in response to James Meredith suing the state of Mississippi to get him into the University of Mississippi, a taxpayer-funded state institution. The governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, said, no, we will blockade the federal government indefinitely. We will interpose Mississippi law over federal law. We will arrest federal marshals who try to bring him in. We will put highway patrol at the border to blockade Army troops coming in, and we will resist you forever. That was what they said. And for 14 days, the federal government tried to come in with increasing numbers of marshals. As Ross Barnett and John Kennedy had a dance on the telephone to try to negotiate their way out of this. There was no way out of it because James Meredith engineered it so that they had no way out of it. The Supreme Court ratified the court order, and James Meredith came in with 30,000 combat troops, 10,000 of which made it to the Oxford area, including one of our guests, with tear gas, live ammunition, and physical force to overwhelm a force of 2,000 plus white civilians who were blockading and rioting and trying to kill James Meredith and 500 federal marshals. That's the situation. That's the first time. And what did he do? He opened the doors for higher education for all of us to follow through as Americans. The second time was 1966, 50 years ago this week, when James Meredith led a one-man walk against fear to inspire Americans to register to vote. He was shot. It turned into a different march. He joined the march at the end. The march symbolized the splits among the civil rights movement, Black Power, Martin Luther King, and there was a great crisis that came out of that. But that event helped inspire thousands of Black Americans to register to vote in Mississippi. Federal registrars followed them. He changed history with his bare hands for the second time in American history, and he nearly got killed for it, for all of us. The third time is today. James Meredith is campaigning for better public education for children in Mississippi and children around America. He wrote an editorial that I helped him with in the Washington Post this week. I recommend to all of you, and I recommend his book, A Mission from God, very strongly to you. Our panelists, I'll introduce you and then I'll ask you each a question if I might, and I'll introduce you in a little more detail. Dr. Judy Alsobrooks Meredith is a retired professor of mass communications at Jackson State University in Mississippi, a Fulbright scholar and executive board member of Fulbright, an award-winning television and radio journalist, anchor, editor, producer, and reporter. She is also the wife of James Meredith, the focus of our event today. Sidna Brower Mitchell was the editor-in-chief of the University of Mississippi newspaper during the 1962 crisis over James Meredith's attending the university, the all-white university, of course. Sidna received worldwide attention and multiple death threats for her courageous editorial stand in favor of the rule of law, which then in Mississippi, as a white or a black person, could easily get you killed in the night or in broad daylight. After graduating from the university, she worked for the World Telegram and Sun in New York, for United Press International in London, and was the owner of weekly newspapers in Morris County, New Jersey for 25 years, retired as deputy director of the New Jersey Council on Affordable Housing in Trenton. In 1962, Henry Gallagher was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Military Police Battalion in Fort Dix, New Jersey, mobilized in an emergency mobilization to go down to Mississippi, rescue the university, rescue the town from being burned down, and save James Meredith's life. He along with thousands of other American troops. He was one of the first troops in to Oxford, and he participated in the deployment of 9,000 regular U.S. Army troops when that event occurred. Thereafter, he was assigned as the officer in charge of James Meredith's personal security detail for months after that. Another incredible story that he wrote about in his book, James Meredith and the Ole Miss Riot, A Soldier's Story. Judy, can I start by asking you, What is James Meredith doing today, and what do you think he sees his legacy as, and what remains to be done for his legacy?
Okay, thanks, Bill. And James sends his regards to all today. James is in the process of trying to convince, and I'm tailoring this a little bit, trying to convince Mississippians to start training their children the way we used to train our children years ago. He is very concerned about public education of children, black and white, and he is extremely concerned about the crime rate of blacks. As you know, we've had a number of events leading up to the Missouri situation, Baltimore, and with police shootings and what have you. His concern is the everyday situation in the black communities with black young people shooting and killing each other. And his philosophy is that he believes that if parents, grandparents, teachers, the church, if we start taking serious control back of our children in terms of raising them up in the way they should be raised, and he says when they're adults they won't go from that. That is his biggest concern, and it is true that he believes, you heard him, he believes that everything is either his fault or his responsibility. So he is walking every day, almost, through black communities, handing out what he calls his information regarding how to get back to raising their children the way they should. He is very concerned about what he considers our most valuable resource in this country. And we all know that if regardless of what community, regardless of what race, regardless of what ethnicity, when everybody is doing well, when one section of our community is doing poorly, it reflects on all of us, the whole country. And so we have these issues, and he believes that it is the black community, the church, grandmothers, and parents to help to turn this situation around with the crime and the poor education in our communities. I think his legacy will probably be, I'm hoping that his legacy will be, I don't know what he thinks it is, that he is a philosopher. He is a brilliant man, extremely brilliant. He reads every day, he's thoughtful, he analyzes everything. And sometimes it's the most simple analysis that anybody could ever come up with. We're always thinking that it's going to take a lot for us to get rid of these problems in our society, when he just comes up with the most simple things like teaching the children the 10 Commandments and keeping that in front of them, and the golden rule. He believes that that is so important. But I think that's his legacy. I think that the one-man person, he hates to be referred to as a civil rights activist. He is not from the civil rights. You have to understand there were several different factions during the civil rights era. He happened to come along during the civil rights era, but he is not a part of that any group, any particular group, he is not a part of. He's not a part of the NAACP, the SNCC, or any movement. And so when he was shot, and Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael and these various people, some of whom you probably never heard of, like the folks from Louisiana.
Deacons.
For defense. For defense.
Yeah.
And all of these people had different ideas, and that's where Black Power was originated from Stokely Carmichael during that march. So I think his legacy will reflect that he was a one-man person provoked by the atrocities that we lived in that day, and even through today. That's what I think his legacy will be, hopefully.
as one triumphant American citizen, which is the proudest boast that he said that in the world, a very special sacrament or covenant between him and the founding fathers and mothers of our country.
Absolutely. He is more, rather than the civil rights, I'm glad you brought that up. Let me clear that up. The U.S. Constitution is the most important document to him. He says, the citizen, we are the most powerful people as citizens, and it doesn't take an entire group. His opposition to being called civil rights is that you don't need civil rights, you don't need people to tell you what your rights are if you are a citizen. So he relies on the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and not the powers that be that determine what your civil rights are. So when he struck out on a one-man walk, not a march, a walk, he was doing that as a citizen, because we are supposed to be able to walk any street in America as a citizen. You can cross this street here, you can walk down the street. But if you are with a group of people and it's called a protest, then you are, in his estimation, having to get permission to do that. You know, you got to get the government, the city government, to give you a license to walk or whatever that's called, a permit to march down the street. He said he wasn't protesting. He was just exhibiting his rights as a citizen. He, in fact, thought he would take the gun away from the man, Norville, I believe is his name, and you know, what happened, of course, James can be a little funny too sometimes, comical. I'm sorry he's not here today. But I did ask him once, well, what did you do? Where were the people? Because there were people along the way. And of course, James is just a little bit older than me, not much, but a little bit. So I was still in high school. And so I said, well, what happened to those people that were, you know, along the way? And he said, when the man called, I just want James Meredith, just James Meredith. He said, everybody just flew in different directions and hit the ground. And of course, that kind of left him up there, you know, crawling away. But he was able to recover. They didn't want him. I talked to an FBI agent just a few days ago that was there. They were very concerned about him getting out of that Memphis hospital. I think he only stayed a few days, and he was able to rejoin the march, what became a march, because Martin Luther King and Stokely were there, and they bumped heads. But at any rate, the FBI agent said it was the worst day of his career. He was a young agent, and he said he was just right. He said it just happened so quickly. And he said, if you see the pictures of this fellow with shades on, he said, that's him. And, you know, there were, I believe he said 4 agents there. And it was nothing they could do. And then, of course, we didn't have the hate crime laws then, because all they could do then was observe. So the FBI did come under fire a bit after that, you know, with some organizations wondering what happened, why didn't they do something to keep this from happening and all of that, but they were there simply to observe.
Fascinating, unbelievable. Thank you. Sidna, you were the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mississippian University newspaper, September 30th, 1962. You are a senior at the university. This war breaks out. It is a small war in Oxford, Mississippi. Everybody tells me this when I interview them about it. Now, my question is, what did you see and feel that night into the next day? Where were you? What were you seeing? And what did you write in your editorial the next morning as the sun came up and people looked to you for guidance as students, what they should be doing with this moment of history?
Actually, I had been at an Ole Miss football game in Jackson where Ross Barnett was out speaking. This was a governor who couldn't even come to the Ole Miss campus to ball games because tomatoes would be thrown at him. But all of a sudden he was a hero and people were rolling with Ross. I came back to the campus. I got there late because my date was going into the Army and left me with some other of his fraternity brothers who were we were listening to the radio, and there was some doubt of whether I could even get back to the campus, and I kept saying, I've got to get back. I did get back later that afternoon and was shocked to see the Lyceum surrounded by federal marshals, and they were standing there really elbow to elbow. How they stood there as long as they did, I don't know. Because even when I was walking around to try to view what was happening and listening to some of the chants, a Molotov cocktail fortunately didn't go off, but the Coke bottle shattered right at my feet. And then I realized, as you say, this is like war. I was one of the student leaders who met in the student union building to talk about what could we do to try to calm things down when the marshals finally shot off the tear gas. And I say how they waited as long as they did when they were dodging bricks and cocktails and rocks. I don't know. And at that point I decided I had to get back to the journalism building to put out a newspaper. And my managing editor, Jan Umber, was assigned to do most of the actual reporting of what was happening because I needed to get the newspaper out. In those days, the female students had to be in their dorms by 11 o'clock. So I was on a pretty strict deadline of that. It was a scary time, and just by virtue of where the journalism building was, it was at two of the main roads going in and out of the university. And all of these people were coming in who were certainly outsiders. And you could just see the hatred and hear it in their voices. And that's when I did, even though I had told the national media and some of the other media that they could use the journalism building because of our typewriters and telephones, and the photo lab, that I decided I'd better lock the door before any of these people who were coming in and saying, I'm going to kill him. And I didn't want to be an innocent victim, obviously, in that.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us what you wrote?
Yes, I was given a copy, so I can. And I'd add one other thing. I was in the photo lab with a photographer when there was a knock on the door telling us that the French correspondent Paul Guillard had been shot and killed. And the photographer said, "Oh my God, that's my man. I have to get out of here." So it was indeed war. Most of the editorials I wrote, I basically said, "Don't riot, boys." But this is the first one that I wrote after the actual riot. Violence will not help. There is an appeal to the entire student body and to anyone concerned with the present situation. Not only do the students chance forfeiting their education by participating in riots, but they are also bringing dishonor and shame to the university and to the state of Mississippi. When students hurled rocks, bottles, and eggs, the federal marshals were forced to resort to tear gas to back off the crowds. When outsiders show their objections in the form of violence, they are seriously injuring the students in their attempt to continue their education. As a student, I beg you to return to your home. This is a battle between the state of Mississippi and the United States government. The university is caught in the middle. The Civil War was fought 100 years ago over almost the same issues, and the United States of America prevailed. The federal government is once again showing its strength and power to uphold the laws of our country. No matter what your convictions, you should follow the advice of Governor Ross Barnett by not taking any action for violence. Blood has already been shed and will continue to flow unless people realize the seriousness of the situation. Whatever your beliefs, you are a citizen of the United States of America and the state of Mississippi, and should preserve peace and harmony of both governments. Brower.
And what were the consequences of that in your life?
Well, ultimately, the campus senate tried to censure me. CENSOR, they were not able to do that, so they tried and censured, CENSURE. That was viewed by the national media and even overseas as being censored by the students that claimed that I was not upholding the traditions of the South. I, again, was basically trying to say, don't riot, don't bring shame to the university. I was admittedly careful in the editorials, and even the fact that I mentioned Ross Barnett in that one, of trying to appeal to people who might have been coming there with some pretty bad motives. Although I personally believe that James Meredith had a right to be there, I knew if I said that it would cause more problems for me and for him, and no one would listen to either one of us. And in fact, Meredith and I were both friends with Dr. Jim Silver, who told us to not ever contact one another and for me not to interview him, just because of the concern of what might happen to in terms of our safety. I also had the KA fraternity that tried to impeach me, but fortunately that all fell through. But there are a whole lot of stories, obviously, that all of us can tell of what happened. I guess I was at the right place at the right time, and I had listened to my father, who's most of his business, he was a small businessman in the dairy and food industry, and 3/4 of his customers were in Mississippi. I was concerned about what would happen based on that, and he told me to not worry, to write what I felt was right. And later, when we were moving my mother, I found a box of letters that some of my father's customers had written, probably 40 or more years ago. And they were saying that they agreed with what I had written. Some said they supported me, but they could never publicly say that because they were concerned about their business. But I read those letters and of course cried and said, okay, Daddy was right.
I see. Wonderful. Henry, this is a terrible question to ask in 5 minutes or less, but how were you pulled into Mississippi the night of the riot, and what was the next 8 or so months like being the security chief for the whole operation with James Meredith going to classes?
Pulled into it. I was a second lieutenant in the military police battalion at Fort Dix, New Jersey. We received orders to go on an alert. My battalion was not informed what was happening. We thought it was an alert on the base. Found out later on the Justice Department, the Pentagon, and the White House wanted to not have too much publicity about this, so only one military police battalion from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, went into riot control training, and they were the first ones onto the campus at 3 o'clock in the morning. My battalion went down south and arrived at Memphis Naval Air Station. We quite frankly thought we were going off to World War III. We were attached to the 18th Airborne Corps. We kept thinking it was going to be an alert on the post, and once we were airborne, we thought we were on our way to either Cuba or Berlin. And we ended up at Memphis Naval Air Station. Lieutenant, what are we doing in Memphis? There are no commies down here. slowly, we became aware of what we had to do. We thought we were going to be backup only, and we'd get up and go home back to Yankee land, because all of my battalion, but for maybe a handful, were from the northern cities. Draftees, you've heard that word before. Some of you people in the room probably remember that name. Maybe you were drafted, but they were all draftees. Many, I might add, from segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Boston, New York. So they were used to the black problem, but not as vicious as we found out that next night. We went into the riots, again kept thinking we were back up, and then no longer were we back up. We were right in the midst of it. I arrived on the campus around 4 o'clock in the morning. There was still some violence happening. Some of my men went downtown and worked with the other soldiers to clear the downtown, and about 10 o'clock that morning, a second lieutenant from Minneapolis, Minnesota, was appointed to be the security guard, the detail officer in charge of James Meredith. While he was on the campus, I was able to handpick 12 sharpshooters that went with me in various locations, following him, shadowing him really, to whatever classes he would go to. Shadowing in the sense that we could not be an armed guard. Justice Department officials made sure this was not going to be another Little Rock where we marched the students back and forth from classes. They wanted James to be walking the campus as freely as any other white students. I was on the campus with him through Thanksgiving of that year, rotated back to Fort Dix, back down to the south in March of that year. So I spent that time with him. And it was a culture of tradition. It was a tradition of segregation. It was insurrection. It was all of the above that was new to me and new to a lot of people in my unit. They did a good job. Years later, I'm glad to see that he went on to continue writing and basing out his position that he was a citizen and there was no civil rights. I will back up what was said here. He was his own movement. There was he did not want to have any part of what Martin Luther King probably sought out for him. Stokely Carmichael surely wanted to be joined with James, and James just said, no, I want to get an education. I was born in the state of Mississippi. Why shouldn't I go to the best, the brand name school in my state? He was and remains to be the most courageous person I'd ever seen. I was in his room the first couple of days going through his mail, all the hate letters, all the death threats. They knew where his parents lived. They knew where his wife in a small town not too far away. Kept looking at these letters, and I said, James, do you know they're going to kill you? They want to do this. And he looked at me and says, Lieutenant, I'm late for my Spanish class. Let's go.
He once told me that folks are always asking him, where did you get all this courage? And he said, I was a black man in Mississippi. I was already dead. I was a dead man, a walking dead man. I have no rights. I can be shot down without penalty in broad daylight. So what did I have to lose? We'd like to show you some photos from a remarkable book by Ed Meek. Ed Meek then was a colleague of Sidna's. He was a young student at the University of Mississippi. This is a book called Riot, based on his photographs. He was a combat photographer that night. He was a young man, and he looked and sounded as though he was from Mississippi, so rioters did not automatically kill him like they killed Paul Guillard, a 30-year-old New York reporter in the same landscape that night. Meek was able to go back and forth from the federal lines to the rebel lines, or whatever you want to call them, and take photographs. Here are some of the photographs before and after the riot itself by this remarkable photographer. This is Governor Ross Barnett on the right, who was widely perceived as an idiot and a clown, but now he was a godhead for 2 weeks in Southern history, and he's loving every minute of it. This is James Meredith. And I'm going to ask anybody to jump in with any memories of or comments. This is the federal marshals landing at Oxford. They're wearing different uniforms. Some of them are wearing sneakers and Hawaiian luau shirts. They were mobilized terribly in a very confused way, and it was a mess and a disaster, their deployment. And the troops had to come in and save them. Very, very brave, all-white federal marshal force.
For the record, they were deputized. They were not marshals, they were deputy marshals. Many of them the Border Patrol, many of them worked for IRS. Many of them had confrontations like this. One of them said he was at Pearl Harbor, and he was more afraid for himself and his men that night than he was at Pearl Harbor.
Yes, one had his throat shot out. There were 100 casualties, bricks, bottles, buckshot, and high-powered shoulder weapons as well. They were in a small war, hand-to-hand combat with their fellow men and with fellow Americans. Very important to know this was not a race riot. This was a white riot. 2,000-3,000 white people against one black American, and eventually the integrated force that came in to save him. And by the way, the federal government, the Kennedy brothers, tried to strip the black troops off the front lines of many of the units that came in to the rescue. James Meredith saw this happening to the 101st Airborne on garbage detail, black soldiers with their guns taken away, ordered to do garbage detail. And he held a press conference and said, "This is happening, it's wrong, I will quit and blame you if you keep this up, stop it." So he forced the president to back down and restore black troops to the front line. Another amazing story.
On Saturday night, we were at Memphis, the order came down, all Negro soldiers would step aside. The Army in those days was the career path in many ways for African Americans. My battalion, we had 3 or 4 line officers, a company commander, many non-commissioned officers, all had to gather over into a little culvert. And it was so stunning. One black soldier was about 5 paces away from me, a E5 sergeant, a barrel voice. My colleague was the officer in charge, a black man, to be in charge of these segregated soldiers. He went up to the sergeant, and with some talking back and forth, he urged him to step back. He came back, he said, "I served my country in Korea. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. I refuse to step back, sir." The captain went up. After a few tears and quiet remarks, they moved away. So 20 minutes later, my battalion, an all-white battalion, went out the gate on our way to Oxford, Mississippi. I found out later on the 503rd MP Battalion, the 101st and the 2nd Infantry Division took the order, ripped it up, threw it away. They went into the situation, fully complemented blacks and whites. But even the congressman or a senator, I think Stennis, received constituents' complaints that black soldiers were seen at the water supplies point in Oxford, Mississippi. What are they doing? Why don't they send whites into the town? So it was that kind of a climate, and that's what some of these, the widow of the captain said he took it with him the rest of his life. He went to Vietnam, highly decorated. He could never get over the fact that he couldn't take his company into Oxford that night.
Incredible. And that you don't read about that in the history books. A resegregation of thousands of American troops ordered by the Kennedy administration because they didn't want to upset the local folks. And
Oh, by the way, on Wednesday of that, my second day with James, he turned to me, he said, "Where are all the Negro soldiers? You surely must have some with you in your battalion." And don't you know, I sent that order up right away to the colonel. All the black soldiers came down that afternoon, and 2 of them were put onto my security detail. A week later, an E5, a sergeant, had a dental appointment or something, and he came late to where we were positioned up on the campus. He came up onto the campus sitting in the passenger seat being driven by a white corporal. For the first time in Mississippians probably have ever seen a white driving a black around in the front seat.
Incredible. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly so we can have some questions from the audience for our panel. This is the very beginning of the riot. A crowd is forming around Army trucks. This is federal marshals taking up position as the sun sets, and thousands of students and outsiders are flocking toward the university, being called by radio, CB radio they had back then, and a drumbeat of fanatic segregationist propaganda by the state apparatus of the media of Mississippi. These are some folks in the crowd. Here's a gentleman in the so-called Confederate kepi cap and rebel uniform, which was characteristic of actually the band, I believe, at Ole Miss then, who's raising the battle flag. The federal marshals now have their tear gas masks on. They're desperately trying not to open fire, but they're starting to get hit by bricks and other objects, and soon weapons fire. The battle is actually underway. Ed Meek is in the grass shooting, because he's got a camera that's pretty visible, and he's shooting from a position in the grass. If you look super close, you'll see marshals in the middle, right in the middle under the tree, trying to protect the Lyceum. They can't fall back because they'll be overrun and the building will be burned down. They don't have enough strength to charge into the night because they're only a couple hundred at this point, and there are thousands of rioters. Downtown Oxford just been cleared out. That was another riot flashpoint. Regular Army troops came in. The day after, a number of vehicles were burned out. They're still smoldering here. Tear gas is filling the air, and this is the campus that Sidna was walking through.
Yeah. And I had a car that looked like one of those, and my parents could not get through on the telephone to get to me. And when they saw the car burning, of course, they were afraid that it was mine and concerned about my safety on it.
Yeah. Under arrest, there were 375 casualties to marshals, civilians, and soldiers, and there were, I believe, 400 arrests. A couple of convictions for rioting. The crowd. This is James Meredith hung in effigy on campus. Regular infantry troops on the town square. Below the American soldier is a Confederate soldier looking south, a statue. The Oxford Town Square. James Meredith here. Is this your outfit, Henry?
Yes, it is.
This is 716th Military Police Battalion guarding James Meredith along with federal marshals coming out of his dorm on the way to class. And I'd like to open it up for questions. Who has a question for anybody in our panel? Yes, sir.
So my name is Irungo. I'm from Kenya. I have a couple of questions. And first of all, just say it's really inspiring to hear Muse Meredith's story. The first question is really, I noticed that he was in University of Ibadan for a short while. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how that, was that formative in any way in terms of his political beliefs? And then the second question is a little bit more mischievous. He, as an avowed Republican, I wondered what his views are on the current bruising race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
My.
You don't have to answer that. Sorry.
You know, you don't talk about politics, sports, religion, you know, you want to keep your friends, you know. So he doesn't talk much about that, but going back to University of Ibadan, he left, this is really his historian here. He left Ole Miss. I think he went to Ibadan first, Nigeria, before New York, right? And he studied, he got a master's from Ibadan University. And then of course he eventually went to New York and got a law degree from Columbia University. So I don't think there was any political thing, but he met a lot of friends in Nigeria. I've met some, they've been guests. I haven't been to Nigeria yet, and I would love to go. In terms of his political thing, this is what he says. And he watches news all day, and I can't stand, no offense to any Fox people here, I cannot stand some of those folks on Fox. You know, some of my colleagues, you know, from Fox. But at any rate, what he does is he sits there and he listens and watches the news, and he has to have the remote, not me. And so he's going from channel to channel to channel all day long, unless he's out, you know, for, you know, taking care of whatever. Then he comes back, and his point is to me, because I can't get him to talk about that, I guess he wants to keep me as a wife too, is that he'll let the rest of us deal with Trump and the rest of the folks. He has his mission. His mission is simply about the children, and he said he could care less whether Trump, whoever gets in, that's not his problem. His issue is with how America is now with educating our children and nurturing our children and raising them up to be all that they can be. He's so focused. He's a brilliant man who stays focused on whatever it is. It's like he keys in on this particular mission, and it's nothing else. He could care less what Trump is saying. Sorry, you all, Trump voters, I'm sorry. But he could care less, really.
On Africa, one of the things he did when he attended the university in Nigeria is he went to Dahomey to trace back to the villages where he thought he heard oral history traditions his people had come from. And he made it all the way up into deepest interior Dahomey, and he found the village. And he said, I talked to the families, and we all sat around the village center, and they were telling me about members of the family, stories they'd heard, vanishing, disappearing, and being kidnapped as if it were yesterday. And he said, in that moment, I realized, for the first time in my life, at age maybe 35, I was a son of Africa. And one other story about presidential politics, I asked him, I called him up the day Obama was inaugurated, and I said, so what are you feeling right now? What do you think? And he said, I don't feel much one way or the other. Should have happened a long time ago, meaning black president. Anyway, another question of any kind. Now's your chance. Yes, sir.
I'm curious as to, Ole Miss seems to not be able to keep themselves out of the newspaper for more than a couple of years. I'm curious as to your thoughts about this heritage, not hate, and whether or not you have a degree from Mississippi, whether you feel that it's cheapened every time one of these things happen.
Well, I don't feel cheap, and I got a PhD from Mississippi State. Sorry, Ole Miss alumni. Oh yeah, what am I? There we go. We're bulldogs. But anyway, I don't think so. You know, there was an incident, what is it, 2 years ago now, where fraternity kids put the noose around James's statue on campus, and and that's another funny story. That's why I'm laughing. Ole Miss tends to call me first to give James a message. So I was coming from Jackson State, finished teaching a class that day, and get this phone call, and they said, Judy, well, we got something to tell you. Just need to let you know before the media calls you that somebody put a noose around James's statue and a rebel flag. And I kind of chuckled because I knew exactly what James was going to say. He does not really, he's okay now with the statue, but he doesn't like he doesn't like statues. He believes that people tend to, you know, the Bible will tell you about statues and monuments and how people tend to worship, in other words, those items. So he doesn't care for that at all. So when they told me that and I drove home, I said, well, they called and said, and I told him what had happened. He said, well, they really should have just blown it up. That's James Meredith, okay?
If you read his book, A Mission from God, he says, I challenge the university here and now to remove the statue and grind it to dust. Don't put it in a closet, because 50 years from now, someone will roll it out and put it on campus again. And the reason, you know, it shows you the interesting relationship he has with the university. I think I'm speaking what he's told me. He loves the university. He's incredibly proud of it. He sees black, white, and other students at that university today in leadership positions, in doing wonderful things. And at the same time, there's an ambiguous relationship, because the event that he triggered that happened there disgraced the state and the university in many ways for decades to come. So there's sort of two universes that sometimes combine and often do. But he has a fascinating point of view about everything. He will give you the opposite opinion to what you think.
You think he would, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I called down the I called to the university the day after, and the 3 students who were involved in the vandalism were expelled that afternoon. That night there was a huge candlelight parade by students across the campus.
Yeah.
Never reported in the network, but it was an overwhelming response in opposition to the vandalism that the 3 students had. So a bigger picture came out of that a week later. So they have made great strides. Governor William Winter, Institute for Racial Reconciliation is on the campus. Great strides have been made to overcome their past. They've embraced their past. They're aware of it, but they're moving on, and they've done wonderful things. And I don't know if that message has ever come north. So often when I went to law school here in Washington after my duty here, and so often they thought of Mississippi and Ole Miss students brick-throwing racists. Well, that's not. They've made great strides to overcome that. And again, the 3 students were expelled the next afternoon, and a overwhelming response, the candlelight parade, tried to set the record right the next night.
When I first came up to New York from Ole Miss, a lot of my friends were Ivy Leaguers, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and they would say, well, going to Ole Miss is like not going to school at all. But we have had a lot of wonderful things, and people come out of Ole Miss, right. And at one point, Ole Miss had more Rhodes Scholars than many of the Ivy League schools. So, you know, that is there, but people, as Henry says, is that people don't hear about a lot of the good things.
When I was doing research on my book, I was in the archives at the library, and I looked over at the yearbooks, and I wanted to find out how many pages were devoted to the beauty queens in the 1962 yearbook. And you can get a lot of information from this. And the early 60s, I mean, even in 1959, Marianne Mobley, was she the Miss America? And then so it became a tradition to go to Ole Miss to be able to someday be in a beauty pageant. Do your makeup on, lasts a half an hour to put your makeup on so you can go out onto the campus and see and be seen. Oh, those days were over. I went through the yearbooks of 2008, 9, 10, something like that, maybe 2 pages devoted to anything that resembled appreciation of beauty. So they've gone a long way.
Well, right after Marianne and Linda Lee Me,
that's right.
We had 3 girls in the Miss America contest, a KD representing Mississippi, a Tridell representing Missouri, and a Kappa representing Tennessee. So 3 Ole Miss students were in that.
I didn't know that.
Well, yes, question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Robin, and I'm actually from Austin. I know your son. I think he lived there for some period in Austin.
Joseph?
Yes.
Oh.
And so I find it interesting. With Roots has been rebroadcast or recreated, the Roots epic miniseries, and there's some criticism about, is that a tired story? Are we tired of hearing that story? Why are we continuing to tell that story over and over again? And as I've listened to Mr. Meredith's story, and I grew up knowing his story, I am inspired again just by being here, by his courage, by his individualism, by him seeing himself as a citizen and taking those rights. I'm curious what you get out of continuing to tell the story. Why do you think that we need to keep telling our stories? And just anything you'd like to say in regards to that.
As James would say, thank you for that question. He thinks that he believes that it has its value to do what we're doing today, and you know, it has its value, but he doesn't get bogged down. He can't understand why we continue to look back and to continue to do this, calling him a hero or anybody that dealt with this. What he is focused on, once again, is the future. He thinks it's not a total waste of time. I'm saying this diplomatic. He's not as diplomatic as I am. And, but it is important for us to now focus on what is wrong and how to fix it. You know, he's more interested in that. He has no interest, really little to no interest in looking back. He just wants us to look forward.
His message is, you and I are on a mission from God, and the mission is to come together and to really improve and help the education of our children. That's his mission now, and that's what he challenges us to do, isn't it?
That's exactly right. He really doesn't care very much about, it's in fact difficult to get him to answer questions like this. Bill can pull it out of him. I can hardly do it, but he refrains from talking about these stories. I mean, I'm hearing some stuff that I've heard for the first time today, just like you. I mean, he doesn't talk about that, but he is consistently talking about and talking to people about improving our communities and our neighborhoods for the sake of the children. You know, he has this thing about children, and you know, if we don't move this thing in a better direction, he feels that America is going to suffer in the long run for not handling this business, and especially the black communities.
Well, I think that, you know, this Jim statue symbolizes the open door policy for Ole Miss. And I think the history is important for people to know what happened back then so it doesn't happen again. That we don't have those problems, and that we can see from the beginning as a young child growing up that we are individuals and we need one another.
But James is embarrassed by what happened in Mississippi in 1962. That is an embarrassment to him, that the lieutenant here had to bring, you know, these forces there. He thinks that it's an embarrassment to him, but it's an embarrassment to the state of Mississippi that this even happened like this. Once again, he wrote the Kennedy administration. His question was, am I or am I not a citizen? If I am, then I'm to go to Ole Miss. And of course, the long legal battle for months and months, I don't know how long that was, but that, you know, that's his goal, is to handle what the problems are today in terms of the Ole Miss story. He knows it's there. He appreciates that it's there because of what is happening now with the number of black students who are going to Ole Miss, and he loves the football team. Oh, he loves that football team. And just know that in 1962, and the lieutenant here can talk more on this, James wanted to go to a game, and he couldn't go then. Am I right about that?
He wanted to go the first weekend. And the Deputy Attorney General Katzenbach thought it was crazy and he would not go, and finally they persuaded him not to go. Let me just give a little more balance also to not just Mississippi. He reminded me about a week after the riots that we should know what's going on up north. His remarks predated Newark, Detroit, Watts. He said, you think it's a problem down here, wait till you see the northern cities explode. Years later, a friend of mine, a columnist here, Mark Shields, went down to Mississippi with me, and he had an interesting remark. He said, you know, the liberals in the North thought great of the civil rights movement until that movement started moving north.
Yeah.
Well, may I ask you to join me in thanking our panel, Judy, Sidney, and Henry. Thank you. And thanks to the Newseum and to the University of Mississippi for putting this together. Thank you.
Yeah.